The auctioneer's hammer struck the wooden podium with a sickening thud. "Going once, going twice." Mayor Harrison Blackwood's voice carried across the packed town square as he prepared to sell a human being like cattle. But just as his gavel began its final descent, a voice cut through the autumn air like thunder. $1,000. The crowd turned in stunned silence toward the back of the square, where a tall stranger in a black coat stood with gold coins glinting in his gloved hand. No one in Millhaven had ever seen that much money at once, and no one could have predicted what would happen next. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trouble began 3 months earlier when Reverend Thomas Mitchell discovered something that would destroy everything he had built in the small Pennsylvania town of Millhaven. His 17-year-old daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, was pregnant, and she refused to name the father. Thomas Mitchell had been Millhaven's spiritual leader for nearly 2 decades, arriving in 1868 as a young seminary graduate with dreams of building a righteous community in the rolling hills outside Philadelphia. The town of 800 souls had embraced him completely, constructing a beautiful white chapel with his guidance and hanging on his every word during Sunday sermons that could stretch past noon when the Spirit moved him. Sarah Elizabeth was the pride of his life and the darling of the congregation. At 17, she possessed a rare combination of intelligence and beauty that reminded everyone who knew her of her late mother, Rebecca, who had died of consumption when Sarah was only 12. The girl had her mother's golden hair that caught sunlight like spun wheat, and her deep blue eyes held a warmth that made even the sternest church elders smile when she sang hymns in her clear soprano voice. But Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell was more than just a pretty face in a pious town. She had been secretly teaching herself to read beyond the Bible, devouring every book she could find in the small collection her father kept locked in his study. She understood mathematics better than most men, could recite poetry from memory, and possessed a curiosity about the world that sometimes worried her father. In a community where women were expected to marry young and focus solely on domestic duties, Sarah's intelligence made some people uncomfortable. The pregnancy changed everything overnight. Thomas Mitchell discovered his daughter's condition on a humid Tuesday morning in August when Sarah fainted during breakfast preparations. Dr. Henry Patterson, the town's only physician, confirmed what her father had begun to suspect, and the news spread through Millhaven like wildfire despite the doctor's promise of discretion. "How could this happen?" Thomas demanded, pacing his small study, while Sarah sat silently in the corner chair where she had received countless gentle lectures throughout her childhood. "Who is responsible for this shame?" Sarah lifted her chin with a defiance that surprised even herself. "I won't tell you, Father, and I won't marry whoever you think I should marry to make this go away." The Reverend stopped pacing, his face flushing red with anger and humiliation. In 20 years of ministry, he had preached countless sermons about moral purity, the sanctity of marriage, and the proper behavior expected of Christian women. Now his own daughter had violated every principle he had taught, and her refusal to name the father made the situation exponentially worse. "Sarah Elizabeth, this is not a matter of choice," he said, his voice taking on the stern tone he usually reserved for particularly stubborn sinners. "You have brought shame upon this family and this congregation. The least you can do is tell me who is responsible so we can arrange a proper marriage." "No," Sarah said quietly, but with a firmness that shocked her father. "I won't ruin someone else's life to save your reputation." What Thomas didn't know, and what Sarah could never tell him, was that the father of her child was someone whose identity would destroy more than just her father's career. The man responsible was Judge Cornelius Ashford, the most powerful figure in the county, a married man with 3 grown children and a reputation for moral righteousness that rivaled her father's own. Judge Ashford had been visiting Millhaven regularly for over a year, ostensibly to oversee legal matters related to the new railroad line being built through the region. But his real interest had been Sarah Elizabeth herself, whom he had first noticed during a church service in the spring of 1869. The judge was 53 years old, with silver hair and the kind of distinguished bearing that commanded respect. In every room he entered, the relationship had begun with seemingly innocent conversations after church services, where Judge Ashford would compliment Sarah's singing and ask about her interests. Gradually, he began finding excuses to visit the parsonage when her father was away making calls on parishioners. He brought her books, encouraged her intellectual curiosity, and made her feel like an adult worthy of serious conversation, rather than a child to be seen and not heard. Sarah had been flattered by the attention of such an important man, mistaking his manipulation for genuine affection. When he began expressing romantic interest, she was too young and inexperienced to recognize the predatory nature of his behavior. The judge had carefully isolated her from potential confidants, convincing her that their relationship was special and secret, something that lesser minds wouldn't understand. The physical relationship had begun gradually, with Judge Ashford using his authority and experience to overcome Sarah's natural hesitation. He convinced her that what they were doing was an expression of mature love, not the sin her father would label it. When Sarah became pregnant, the judge immediately distanced himself, claiming that any public acknowledgement of their relationship would destroy both their lives. "You must understand, my dear," he had told her during their final private meeting, "I have a wife, a career, and responsibilities that extend far beyond personal desires. If this situation becomes public, I will deny everything. And who will believe a preacher's daughter over a respected judge?" Sarah had realized too late that she had been used and discarded, but she also understood that exposing Judge Ashford would indeed destroy her completely while barely damaging him. A man in his position could weather such a scandal, especially against the word of a pregnant, unmarried girl. Sarah would be branded a liar and a seductress. Her child would grow up bearing the stigma of illegitimacy, and her father's ministry would be finished. So she chose silence, even when that silence cost her everything. The congregation's reaction to Sarah's pregnancy was swift and merciless. Within a week of the news spreading, attendance at Sunday services dropped by half. Families who had been close friends of the Mitchell family began crossing the street to avoid speaking to them. Children were forbidden to play with Sarah or even acknowledge her presence. Mrs. Dorothy Hampton, the wife of Millhaven's most successful merchant, led the campaign against the Mitchell family with the zealousness of someone who had always resented the reverence shown to the preacher and his daughter. She organized meetings in her parlor where the good women of the town discussed what should be done about the scandal in their midst. "It's a disgrace to the entire community," Mrs. Hampton declared during one of these gatherings, her voice dripping with false moral outrage. "How can Reverend Mitchell expect to guide our souls when he cannot even control his own household? And that girl, carrying on like a common strumpet while singing hymns on Sunday mornings. It's an insult to every decent woman in Millhaven." The campaign against the Mitchell family was carefully orchestrated to appear spontaneous and righteous, but it was actually driven by a combination of jealousy, social climbing, and genuine moral outrage. Many of the women leading the charge had always resented Sarah's beauty and intelligence, while their husbands had harbored secret resentments about Thomas Mitchell's moral authority over the community. Mayor Harrison Blackwood, a man whose own moral character was questionable at best, saw an opportunity to consolidate his power by positioning himself as the defender of community standards. Blackwood had been chafing under Reverend Mitchell's influence for years, particularly when the preacher had opposed some of the mayor's more questionable business dealings. "The people of Millhaven deserve better than this," Blackwood announced. During a hastily called town meeting in September, "We cannot allow our community's reputation to be tarnished by this scandal. Something must be done." Thomas Mitchell attempted to defend his daughter and maintain his position, but the tide of public opinion had turned decisively against them. When he tried to deliver his regular Sunday sermon, he found the chapel nearly empty except for a handful of elderly parishioners who were too loyal or too stubborn to abandon him completely. "I understand that my family has disappointed many of you," Thomas said from the pulpit, his voice carrying clearly through the mostly empty sanctuary. "But I ask you to remember that Christian charity demands forgiveness, and that young people sometimes make mistakes that require our guidance rather than our condemnation." His words fell on largely deaf ears. The few people present listened politely, but Thomas could see in their faces that their support was wavering. Some looked embarrassed to be there, while others seemed to be attending more out of curiosity than faith. The final blow came when the church board, led by Mrs. Hampton's husband, formally requested Thomas's resignation. The vote was 7-3, with only the oldest board members supporting their longtime pastor. The board cited moral turpitude within the pastor's family and loss of community confidence as grounds for dismissal. "You have 30 days to vacate the parsonage," Board Chairman Robert Hampton informed Thomas after the vote. "We trust you'll find suitable arrangements for yourself and your daughter elsewhere." Thomas felt his world collapsing around him. The ministry had been his entire life, his calling from God, and his identity for 2 decades. Without it, he was nothing more than a middle-aged man with no practical skills and a pregnant daughter who had become a social pariah. Worse yet, they had no money saved and no family to turn to for help. Sarah watched her father's decline with growing guilt and despair. She had hoped that by keeping Judge Ashford's identity secret, she could at least protect her father's position and reputation. Instead, her silence had only made everything worse, allowing the community to imagine scenarios that were probably more damaging than the truth. As October arrived with its crisp autumn air and changing leaves, the Mitchell family faced complete destitution. Thomas had tried to find work in neighboring towns, but word of the scandal had spread throughout the region. No church would hire a minister whose own daughter had fallen into disgrace, and his lack of practical skills made him unsuitable for most other employment. Sarah, now visibly pregnant and approaching her 18th birthday, found herself the target of increasingly cruel treatment from the townspeople. Children threw stones at her when she walked to the general store for supplies. Women whispered loudly about her whenever she appeared in public, making sure she could hear their condemnation. Men looked at her with a mixture of desire and disgust that made her skin crawl. The situation reached its breaking point when their landlord, acting on pressure from prominent townspeople, gave them notice to vacate the parsonage immediately. With nowhere to go and no money to pay for lodging elsewhere, Thomas and Sarah faced the prospect of sleeping in the streets with winter approaching. It was then that Mayor Blackwood proposed his solution. "I've been thinking about your situation, Reverend," Blackwood said when he visited the parsonage on a cold October morning. "There might be a way to resolve this matter that would benefit everyone involved." Thomas looked up from the packing crates scattered around his study, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in weeks. "What do you mean?" Blackwood's smile was cold and calculating. "Well, your daughter needs a husband to provide for her and the child. The town needs to be rid of this scandal. And there are several men in the region who might be willing to take on a young wife, even under these circumstances, for the right price." The horror of Blackwood's suggestion hit Thomas like a physical blow. You're talking about selling my daughter like a piece of property. I'm talking about practical solutions to practical problems, Blackwood replied smoothly. Sarah has no prospects here, and you have no means to support her or a grandchild. This way, she gets a husband and security, the child gets a father, and you get enough money to start over somewhere else. Sarah, who had been listening from the kitchen, stepped into the study with her hands protectively placed over her growing belly. I won't be sold to the highest bidder like a broodmare, she said, her voice trembling with anger and fear. Blackwood's expression hardened. I'm afraid you don't have much choice in the matter, young lady. Your father owes money all over town. You have no means of support, and winter is coming. This is the only reasonable solution to your predicament. What none of them knew was that Judge Ashford had been quietly encouraging Blackwood's plan from behind the scenes. The judge was desperate to ensure that Sarah never identified him as the father of her child, and removing her from the community entirely seemed like the perfect solution. He had even suggested specific men who might be interested in bidding, choosing individuals he knew would take Sarah far from Pennsylvania, where she could never threaten his reputation. As Thomas struggled with the impossible choice between his principles and his daughter's survival, Sarah found herself facing a future that seemed worse than death itself. She would be sold to a stranger, forced to raise her child in an unknown place with a man who viewed her as purchased property rather than a human being. But unknown to any of them, someone had been watching the situation unfold with growing anger and determination, someone who had his own reasons for wanting to help Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell and who possessed the resources to outbid anyone Mayor Blackwood might find. The stranger had arrived in Millhaven 3 days earlier, checking into the town's only inn under the name William Carter. He was tall and lean, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and piercing grey eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His clothing was expensive but not flashy, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to authority. William Carter was not his real name, and his presence in Millhaven was not coincidental. He had been tracking Judge Ashford's activities for months as part of a larger investigation into corruption and abuse of power throughout the region. When his sources informed him about the situation developing in Millhaven, he realized he had found both an opportunity for justice and a chance to save an innocent young woman from a terrible fate. As the town prepared for its cruel auction, none of them could have imagined that their carefully laid plans were about to be shattered by a man who had his own score to settle with the powerful men who had orchestrated Sarah's downfall. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning of the auction dawned grey and cold, with October frost painting the windows of Millhaven's buildings in delicate patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the tiny room above Henderson's general store, where she and her father had been allowed to stay for their final 3 nights in town as an act of what Mr. Henderson called Christian charity. Sarah pressed her hands against her growing belly, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her, as if sensing the tension that filled the air. At nearly 6 months pregnant, she could no longer hide her condition, and the loose grey dress that Mrs. Henderson had reluctantly provided did little to disguise her shape. Her golden hair, once her pride, hung limp and unwashed around her shoulders, and dark circles under her blue eyes testified to weeks of sleepless nights. Sarah. Her father's voice came through the thin door, barely above a whisper. It's time. Thomas. Mitchell looked as though he had aged 10 years in the past month. His once proud shoulders sagged under the weight of his failure to protect his daughter, and his hands shook constantly now, whether from nerves or the cheap whiskey he had started drinking to numb his shame. The black suit he wore for the occasion was the same one he had preached in every Sunday for 15 years, but now it hung loose on his diminished frame. "Father," Sarah said as she opened the door, "you don't have to do this. We could leave town tonight, find some other way to survive." Thomas shook his head, unable to meet her eyes. "With what money? Winter's coming and you're carrying a child. I can't provide for you, and I won't watch you starve in some ditch because of my pride." His voice broke slightly. Maybe one of the bidders will be kind. Maybe you'll find happiness somehow." They both knew he was lying. The men who had expressed interest in the auction were not looking for wives to cherish and protect. They wanted young women who would be completely dependent on them, who could be controlled and used without question. Mayor Blackwood had made the nature of the arrangement crystal clear. The highest bidder would own Sarah as surely as if she were livestock. As they walked through the streets toward the town square, Sarah noticed how the usual morning bustle seemed muted and strange. People who would normally greet her father with respect now turned away or stared with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. Children who had once loved her Sunday school lessons now hid behind their mother's skirts when she passed. Mrs. Dorothy Hampton stood on her front porch, dressed in her finest black dress, as if attending a funeral. Her expression was one of satisfied righteousness, the look of someone who believed she was witnessing divine justice. When Sarah's eyes met hers, Mrs. Hampton smiled coldly and called out in a voice loud enough for the entire street to hear, "Such a shame when young people refuse to learn proper moral lessons," she announced to no one in particular. "But perhaps today's proceedings will serve as an education for other girls who might be tempted to stray from the path of righteousness." Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation, but she forced herself to walk steadily forward. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break down completely, not when they had already taken everything else from her. The town square was packed with more people than Sarah had ever seen gathered in one place in Millhaven. Word of the auction had spread throughout the surrounding counties, drawing not only curious locals, but also men who had traveled considerable distances for the opportunity to bid on a young, educated woman. The crowd was almost entirely male, with only a handful of women present to witness what they considered a moral lesson. A wooden platform had been erected near the center of the square, with a podium where Mayor Blackwood stood shuffling through official-looking papers. The platform was the same one used for Independence Day speeches and Harvest Festival announcements, but today it had been transformed into something that made Sarah's stomach turn with revulsion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Blackwood called, out, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd, "we are gathered here today to resolve a matter that has brought considerable distress to our community. Miss Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, having brought shame upon herself and her family, and having no means of support for herself or her unborn child, has been placed under the guardianship of the town council for the purposes of securing her a suitable marriage." Sarah felt the crowd's eyes on her like physical weight, men evaluating her appearance and calculating her worth, while women whispered among themselves about the spectacle. She wanted to run, to disappear, to be anywhere but standing on this platform while strangers decided her fate. "The bidding will begin at $50, Blackwood continued, with increases of no less than $5. The winning bidder will assume all responsibility for Miss Mitchell's welfare and that of her child, with the marriage to be performed immediately following the conclusion of the auction." $50. Sarah closed her eyes, trying not to think about what it meant to have her entire life valued at less than the cost of a good horse. Around the square, she could see the men who had come to bid on her, their faces revealing various combinations of lust, calculation, and cold opportunism. At the front of the crowd stood Jeremiah Winters, a cattle rancher from 3 counties, North, who was known for his brutal treatment of both animals and the workers on his land. Winters was nearly 60 years old, with graying hair and cruel eyes, that had been examining Sarah like livestock ever since he arrived in town. He had buried 2 wives already, both of whom had died under suspicious circumstances that no one had bothered to investigate too closely. Near the back of the crowd, Sarah spotted Ezra Coleman, a mine owner whose operations were notorious for dangerous working conditions and frequent accidents. Coleman was younger than Winters, perhaps 40, but his reputation was even worse. The women who worked in his company town lived in constant fear, and several had simply vanished over the years when they became troublesome. There were others, men whose names Sarah didn't know, but whose intentions were written clearly on their faces. Some appeared to view her as a business investment, a young woman who could provide labor and children while costing relatively little to maintain. Others looked at her with a hunger that made her skin crawl, clearly more interested in her youth and beauty than in any practical considerations. "Do I hear $50?" Blackwood called out. "50?" shouted Jeremiah Winters immediately, his gravelly voice cutting through the morning air. "60!" called out Ezra Coleman, not to be outdone. The bidding continued to climb steadily, with various men calling out increasing amounts, while Sarah stood frozen on the platform, trying to divorce her mind from what was happening to her body. Each bid felt like another chain being wrapped around her, binding her to a future she couldn't bear to contemplate. As the amount climbed past $100, the field of bidders began to narrow. Some men dropped out when the price exceeded what they considered reasonable for damaged goods, while others bid more aggressively as they realized how few competitors remained. $150, Winters called out, his confidence growing as several other bidders shook their heads and stepped back from the crowd. $160, Coleman responded, his jaw set with determination. Sarah's father stood at the edge of the platform, his face white with anguish as he watched his daughter being sold to the highest bidder. Several times he seemed about to speak, to call off the entire proceedings, but each time he stopped himself with the knowledge that they had no alternative. The bidding war between Winters and Coleman continued past $200, an astronomical sum for most of the people watching. The crowd began to murmur with excitement, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented in their small community. $230, Winters called out, his voice strained with the effort of reaching such a high bid. Coleman hesitated for the first time, clearly calculating whether Sarah was worth such an enormous investment. The pause stretched long enough that Mayor Blackwood began to raise his gavel. "Going once at $230 to Mr. Jeremiah Winters," he announced, unable to hide his satisfaction at the unexpectedly high final price. Sarah felt her knees weaken as she realized her fate was about to be sealed. Jeremiah Winters stepped forward slightly, a triumphant smile spreading across his weathered face as he anticipated claiming his prize. She had heard enough stories about his previous wives to know that her life would be short and filled with suffering under his control. "Going twice," Blackwood continued, clearly enjoying the dramatic moment. It was then that the voice cut through the air like thunder, stopping the proceedings cold. $1,000. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that fell over the square. Every head turned toward the back of the crowd, where a tall figure in a black coat stood, with one gloved hand raised. The man's face was partially shadowed by the brim of his hat, but his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and exclamations. $1,000 was more money than most of the people present had ever seen in one place, an amount that transformed the auction from a local spectacle into something that defied comprehension. Mayor Blackwood's mouth fell open in astonishment. Even he had not expected the bidding to reach such heights, and the sudden appearance of this mysterious stranger had clearly caught him completely off guard. Did you say $1,000? Blackwood stammered, trying to regain his composure. The stranger stepped forward through the crowd, which parted before him like water. As he moved into the light, Sarah could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 35 years old, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and piercing grey eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with calculating intelligence. His clothing was expensive but not ostentatious, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who was accustomed to power. "I said $1,000, the stranger confirmed, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Cash to be paid immediately upon completion of the transaction." Jeremiah Winters sputtered with indignation. "Now see here, stranger, this isn't some big city auction house. We don't need outsiders coming in, and are you increasing your bid?" The stranger interrupted coolly, fixing Winters with a stare that made the older man step backward involuntarily. Winters looked around, desperately, as if hoping someone would support his objection, but the crowd was too stunned by the enormous sum to offer any assistance. $230 had been extraordinary. 1,000 was beyond imagination. No, I can't match that amount," Winters admitted reluctantly, his dreams of owning Sarah evaporating in the face of financial reality. Coleman and the other bidders had already stepped back, clearly understanding that none of them could compete with such resources. The mysterious stranger had effectively ended the auction with a single bid that dwarfed all previous offers. Mayor Blackwood struggled to process what was happening. The auction was supposed to be a simple matter of disposing of an unwanted problem, while making a modest profit for the town's coffers. Instead, he found himself dealing with a sum of money that could fund municipal projects for years, offered by a man whose identity and motives were completely unknown. "May I ask your name, sir?" Blackwood inquired, trying to reassert some control over the proceedings. "William Carter," the stranger replied, producing a leather wallet from his coat. "And I believe you requested cash payment." Sarah watched in amazement as the man who called himself William Carter counted out gold coins onto a small table that someone had hurriedly brought forward. The metallic clicking of the coins seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed square, each piece representing more wealth than most of the townspeople would see in their entire lives. As the counting continued, Sarah found herself studying her unexpected benefactor more closely. There was something familiar about him, though she was certain they had never met. His bearing suggested military training or some other form of discipline, and his eyes held a hardness that spoke of difficult experiences. Most importantly, when he glanced up at her during the payment process, she saw something in his expression that she had almost forgotten existed: genuine human compassion. The payment completed, Mayor Blackwood found himself holding more money than the town's annual budget, while facing a stranger who had just purchased the right to marry Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. The mayor's satisfaction at disposing of his problem was now mixed with curiosity and a growing sense of unease about what he might have unleashed. "The marriage ceremony will be performed immediately," Blackwood announced, gesturing toward Reverend Philip Hawthorne, who had been brought in from a neighboring town to officiate, since Thomas Mitchell was obviously unavailable for the task. William Carter nodded calmly. "That will be acceptable." He turned to look directly at Sarah for the first time since making his bid. "Miss Mitchell, if you would join me?" Sarah descended from the platform on unsteady legs, her mind reeling from the sudden transformation of her circumstances. Minutes ago, she had been facing a life of abuse and probable early death at the hands of Jeremiah Winters. Now she found herself about to marry a complete stranger who had paid a fortune for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. As she approached William Carter, he removed his hat and spoke to her in a voice low enough that only she could hear. "Miss Mitchell, I know this is frightening and confusing. I can't explain everything right now, but I want you to know that you're safe. I'm not here to hurt you or exploit you. Do you understand?" Sarah looked into his grey eyes, searching for any sign of deception or hidden cruelty. Instead, she found only sincerity and a hint of something that might have been regret. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" William Carter was quiet for a moment, his expression growing distant as if he were remembering something painful. "Because someone should have done the same for my sister," he said finally, "and because the men responsible for your situation deserve to learn that their actions have consequences." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Reverend Hawthorne called for the ceremony to begin, and she found herself standing beside a stranger who had just paid $1,000 to save her from a fate worse than death. As the Reverend began to speak the familiar words of the marriage ceremony, Sarah realized that her life had just taken another completely unexpected turn. She was about to become Mrs. William Carter, wife to a man whose motives she didn't understand, but whose intervention had just rescued her from certain doom. The crowd watched in fascination as the most unusual wedding in Millhaven's history proceeded, while somewhere in the background, Judge Cornelius Ashford observed the proceedings with growing alarm, realizing that his careful plans to eliminate Sarah Mitchell as a threat had just gone catastrophically wrong. The marriage ceremony concluded with a kiss that was more formality than affection, witnessed by hundreds of curious onlookers who still couldn't quite believe what they had just seen. As Reverend Hawthorne pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah found herself studying William Carter's profile, searching for clues about the man who had just become her husband with a single, impossible bid. "Ladies and gentlemen," William announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone that had silenced the auction. "My wife and I will be departing Millhaven within the hour. I trust there are no legal impediments to our immediate departure." Mayor Blackwood, still clutching the leather pouch containing $1,000 in gold coins, shook his head numbly. The speed with which events had unfolded left him struggling to maintain his composure. No impediments at all. The marriage is legal and binding, and Mrs. Carter is free to leave with her husband." The crowd began to disperse slowly, with most people reluctant to miss any additional drama that might unfold. Sarah noticed how different their expressions had become in the space of an hour. Where before she had seen contempt and moral superiority, now she detected confusion, envy, and something that might have been respect. $1,000 had transformed her from a fallen woman into a mysterious figure worthy of speculation. William offered Sarah his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. "Shall we collect your belongings, Mrs. Carter?" The sound of her new name spoken aloud made Sarah's head spin. This morning she had been Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, pregnant and disgraced, facing a future of abuse and degradation. Now she was Mrs. William Carter, wife to a man wealthy enough to throw away a fortune on a stranger's welfare. The transformation felt surreal, like something from one of the romantic novels she had secretly read in her father's study. As they walked toward Henderson's general store to gather her few possessions, Sarah became aware of the elegant carriage waiting at the edge of the town square. The vehicle was clearly expensive, pulled by 4 magnificent black horses that stood calmly despite the crowd and commotion. A driver in fine livery sat patiently on the box, as if waiting for mysterious millionaires to purchase wives at small town. Auctions was a perfectly normal part of his employment. "Mr. Carter," Sarah said quietly as they walked, "I need to know something before we go any further. What do you expect from this marriage? What do you want from me?" William slowed his pace, considering his answer carefully. "What I want, Mrs. Carter, is to ensure that you and your child are safe and provided for. Beyond that, I expect nothing from you except perhaps your patience, while I explain some very complicated circumstances. They had reached the general store, where Mr. Henderson waited nervously by the door. The merchant's attitude towards Sarah had undergone a complete reversal in the past hour. Where he had previously treated her with barely concealed disdain, he now showed the deference due to the wife of an obviously wealthy man. "Mrs. Carter," Henderson said, emphasizing her new title, "I've taken the liberty of packing your belongings. Please accept my congratulations on your marriage." Sarah's belongings consisted of 2 dresses, some undergarments, a few books, and a small jewelry box that had belonged to her mother. Everything she owned in the world fit into a single worn leather satchel that had seen better days, decades ago. As they prepared to leave, Thomas Mitchell appeared in the doorway, his face a mixture of relief, shame, and profound sadness. The events of the morning had aged him even further, and he moved like a man carrying an enormous weight. "Sarah," he said softly, "I need you to know that I'm sorry. Sorry for failing you. Sorry for allowing this situation to develop. Sorry for not being strong enough to protect you better." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she embraced her father for what might be the last time. Despite everything that had happened, despite his weakness and his failures, he was still her father, and she loved him. "I forgive you, Papa," she whispered, using the childhood name she hadn't spoken in years. "You did the best you could with an impossible situation." William Carter stepped forward, extending his hand to Thomas. "Reverend Mitchell, your daughter will be well cared for. You have my word on that." Thomas studied William's face intently, as if trying to read his character in his features. "Who are you, Mr. Carter? Why would you do something like this for strangers?" "I'm someone who believes that evil should not go unchallenged," William replied cryptically, "and your daughter is not truly a stranger to me, though she doesn't know it yet." Before either Sarah or her father could ask what he meant, by that statement, William had taken Sarah's satchel and was guiding her toward the waiting carriage. The driver climbed down to help her into the vehicle, treating her with the same respect he would show any wealthy man's wife. The carriage interior was even more luxurious than its exterior suggested, with soft leather seats, fine wool blankets, and small details that spoke of exceptional craftsmanship and expense. Sarah had never been inside such a vehicle. The contrast with her circumstances just hours earlier was almost overwhelming. As the carriage began to move, carrying her away from the only life she had ever known, Sarah finally allowed herself to break down. The emotional strain of the past months, combined with the shock and confusion of the morning's events, overwhelmed her completely. She sobbed with the intensity of someone who had been holding back tears for far too long. William handed her a clean handkerchief and waited patiently for the storm of emotion to pass. When she finally regained her composure, he spoke gently. "I know this is frightening, Mrs. Carter. Your entire world has changed in the space of a few hours, and you have no reason to trust me or believe that my intentions are honorable. But I want to start by telling you some things that will help you understand why I was in Millhaven today." Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at him expectantly, hungry for any information that might help her make sense of her situation. "My real name is William Hartwell," he began, "and I am a federal investigator working for the Department of Justice in Washington. For the past 2 years, I've been investigating a network of corrupt officials operating throughout Pennsylvania and the surrounding states." This revelation stunned Sarah into silence. A federal investigator. The implications of his statement began to sink in as she realized that her rescue might have been part of something much larger than a random act of charity. "Judge Cornelius Ashford is at the center of this investigation," William continued, watching Sarah's face carefully for her reaction. We have evidence that he has been using his position to enrich himself through various illegal schemes, but we've been missing the key testimony we need to bring charges against him." Sarah's face went white as she understood the connection. "You know about Judge Ashford and me." "We suspected," William said gently. "Our investigation uncovered a pattern of young women who had been involved with the judge and then disappeared under mysterious circumstances. When we learned about your situation in Millhaven, the pieces began to fit together." The carriage swayed gently as it navigated the rural roads leading away from town, carrying Sarah toward a future she still couldn't comprehend. William's revelation, that he was a federal investigator, explained his resources and his presence in Millhaven, but it raised new questions about what he expected from her. "You think Judge Ashford is the father of my child," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think Judge Ashford has been preying on young women for years, using his position and authority to manipulate them into relationships they couldn't resist or escape," William replied. "I think you're probably not the first, and without intervention, you wouldn't have been the last." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the information. She had thought her situation was unique, that she had been specially chosen by the judge because of some quality that made her different from other girls. Learning that she was likely just one victim in a pattern of abuse was both devastating and strangely liberating. "There were others?" she asked. "At least 5 that we know of," William confirmed. 3 disappeared completely after rejecting the judge's advances or threatening to expose him. 2 died under suspicious circumstances after giving birth to children who bore a strong resemblance to Judge Ashford. The horror of what William was telling her made Sarah feel physically sick. She had been naive enough to believe that her relationship with the judge, however inappropriate, had been based on genuine affection. Now she understood that she had been nothing more than a victim in a systematic pattern of predatory behavior. "What happened to the children?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Unknown. They disappeared along with their mothers. We suspect they were either killed or sold to distant families to eliminate any evidence of the judge's activities." Sarah's hands moved protectively to her belly, where her unborn child shifted restlessly. The baby she carried was not just the result of her own poor judgment. It was evidence of a crime that had destroyed other women and children before her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "What do you want me to do?" William's expression became more serious. Judge Ashford's corruption extends far beyond his personal crimes. He has been taking bribes to fix trials, selling judicial appointments, and using his influence to protect criminal enterprises throughout the region. But his personal behavior is the key to everything else, because it gives us leverage over him. "You want me to testify against him?" "I want to give you the choice," William corrected. "You can testify against him, which would require telling your story publicly and facing the scrutiny that comes with challenging a powerful man. Or you can simply disappear, start a new life somewhere safe, and let us find other ways to bring him down." The carriage had been climbing steadily into the mountains east of Millhaven, and Sarah could see that they were approaching an impressive estate nestled among the autumn-colored trees. The house was large but not ostentatious, built of local stone with multiple chimneys, sending smoke into the crisp air. "Where are we?" Sarah asked. "My family's property," William replied. "It's been in the Hartwell family for 3 generations. My sister lived here before she—" He paused, his expression darkening with old pain. "What happened to your sister?" William was quiet for a long moment, staring out the carriage window at the approaching house. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of grief and anger that helped Sarah understand why he had been so determined to save her. Her name was Catherine. She was 17, beautiful, intelligent, and completely trusting. 3 years ago, She fell under the influence of a powerful man who convinced her that he loved her, that their relationship was special and meaningful. When she became pregnant, he abandoned her completely, denying any involvement and threatening to destroy her reputation if she spoke about their relationship. Sarah felt her heart breaking for this woman she had never met, recognizing her own story in Catherine's experience. The man was Judge Cornelius Ashford, William continued, his voice hardening with controlled fury. Catherine tried to expose him, to make him take responsibility for their child. Instead, she was found dead in the river, 2 days before she was supposed to testify before a grand jury. The authorities ruled it suicide, but I knew better. The carriage came to a stop in front of the house, but neither William nor Sarah moved to get out. The weight of his revelation hung between them, like a physical presence. "Judge Ashford killed your sister," Sarah said, understanding now why William had been in Millhaven, why he had paid such an enormous sum to save her from the auction. "Judge Ashford has killed several women, including my sister," William confirmed. "And he would have killed you too, eventually, once you became too much of a liability. The auction was probably his idea, a way to get rid of you permanently, while making it look like a legitimate solution to your predicament." Sarah shivered, as she realized how close she had come to disappearing forever. If William hadn't intervened, she would have been sold to Jeremiah Winters or Ezra Coleman, men who would have worked her to death in remote locations where no one would ever think to look for her. "So this marriage," she said slowly, "it's not really a marriage at all. It's a cover story for your investigation." William looked at her directly, his grey eyes serious but kind. "The marriage is completely legal and will be honored in every respect. What it becomes beyond that depends entirely on what you choose. I won't force you into anything, Mrs. Carter. You've had enough of powerful men making decisions about your life." As they finally descended from the carriage and approached the house, Sarah realized that despite all the revelations and complications, she felt safer than she had in months. William Hartwell might be a stranger with his own agenda, but he was also the first man in a long time who had treated her as a human being deserving of respect and protection. Whatever came next, whatever choices she would have to make about testifying against Judge Ashford, at least she would be making them as a free woman rather than as property sold to the highest bidder. The house's front door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman in a neat dark dress who looked at Sarah with curiosity but without judgment. For the first time since her pregnancy had been discovered, Sarah felt like she might have found a place where she could simply be herself rather than playing a role in someone else's drama. But as they entered the house, none of them noticed the lone rider who had followed the carriage at a discreet distance, or the way he turned his horse around and headed back toward Millhaven with urgent news for Judge Cornelius Ashford about the federal investigator who had just rescued the one person who could destroy everything the judge had built. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had been expecting William's arrival, but the young woman he brought with him was not what she had anticipated. As the housekeeper of the Hartwell estate for over 20 years, Eleanor had learned to read people quickly and accurately. The girl who stepped hesitantly through the front door carried herself with dignity despite her obvious exhaustion and emotional strain, but there was something broken about her that reminded Eleanor painfully of Catherine Hartwell in her final weeks. "Mrs. Carter," William said formally, "may I present Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who manages this household and has been like a mother to my family for more years than I care to count." Eleanor studied Sarah with shrewd but kind eyes, taking in the young woman's condition, her simple clothes, and the way she held herself as if expecting another blow to fall at any moment. Despite her pregnancy and her circumstances, there was an unmistakable refinement about her that spoke of good breeding and education. "Welcome to Hartwell House, my dear," Eleanor said warmly, stepping forward to take Sarah's hands in her own. You look exhausted. Let me show you to your room so you can rest properly for the first time in what I suspect has been far too long. The interior of Hartwell House was even more impressive than its exterior suggested. High ceilings, polished wood floors, and carefully chosen furnishings created an atmosphere of comfortable elegance that spoke of old money and established family traditions. Sarah found herself thinking of her father's modest parsonage, which could have fit into the house's main hall with room to spare. As Eleanor led her up a broad staircase, Sarah caught glimpses of oil paintings that appeared to be family portraits, spanning several generations. She noticed that many of the frames held empty spaces where paintings had obviously been removed, and she wondered if these had been portraits of Catherine. "Here we are," Eleanor announced, opening the door to a bedroom that was larger than any room Sarah had ever occupied. The space was decorated in soft blues and whites, with a four-poster bed, a writing desk by the window, and a sitting area arranged around a small fireplace. This was Catherine's room. "William thought you might be comfortable here." Sarah hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether she should be honored or disturbed by the offer to occupy the room of William's murdered sister. Eleanor seemed to understand her uncertainty. "Catherine would have wanted someone like you to use this room," she said gently. "She always believed that women should help each other, especially when facing difficult circumstances. I think she would have liked you very much." After Eleanor left her alone to rest, Sarah stood at the room's large window, looking out over grounds that stretched toward distant mountains. The view was breathtaking, but she found her thoughts turning to the young woman who had once stood at this same window, probably looking out at the same mountains while carrying her own burden of fear and secrets. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Eleanor returning with tea or some other refreshment. Instead, William entered, carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents. His expression was serious, and Sarah realized that whatever respite she had been granted was about to end. "I apologize for disturbing your rest so soon," he said, "but there are some things you need to see before we go any further. Documents that will help you understand exactly what we're dealing with." Sarah settled into one of the chairs by the fireplace, while William spread papers across the small table between them. The documents appeared to be official reports, correspondence, and what looked like financial records. "This is what we've gathered about Judge Ashford's activities over the past 5 years," William explained. "I want you to understand the full scope of what he's been doing, so you can make an informed decision about whether to help us stop him." The first document was a report from a private investigator detailing Judge Ashford's financial holdings. Sarah was amazed to see that the judge owned property in 7 different states, had accounts in banks throughout the region, and possessed wealth far beyond what his official salary could possibly support. "How does a county judge accumulate this much money?" Sarah asked. "By selling verdicts," William replied grimly. "We have evidence that Judge Ashford has been taking bribes to influence the outcomes of trials for at least 5 years. Criminal defendants with enough money can essentially purchase their freedom, while honest citizens who can't afford to pay face harsh sentences for minor offenses." The next set of documents detailed specific cases where the judge's decisions had been clearly influenced by financial considerations. Sarah read about a wealthy merchant who had beaten his wife nearly to death, but received only a fine after paying the judge $500. She learned about a mine owner who had been absolved of responsibility for a collapse that killed 12 workers, despite clear evidence of negligence, after making a substantial contribution to the judge's private accounts. "This is monstrous," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "How many people have suffered because of his greed?" "More than we'll ever know," William replied. "But the corruption goes deeper than just taking bribes. Judge Ashford has been using his position to protect a network of criminal enterprises throughout the region. The documents revealed connections between the judge and various illegal operations, smuggling rings, illegal gambling establishments, and even human trafficking networks that moved workers between states under conditions that amounted to slavery. In each case, Judge Ashford had used his authority to prevent investigations or to ensure that charges were dismissed. But it was the final set of documents that truly horrified Sarah. These were reports about the women who had been involved with Judge Ashford personally, and the pattern they revealed was both systematic and terrifying. He targets young women from respectable families who find themselves in vulnerable situations, William explained as Sarah read through the files. Usually women who have lost their fathers or whose families have fallen on hard times. He presents himself as a protector and benefactor, someone who can solve their problems and provide security. Sarah recognized her own story in the pattern William described. Judge Ashford had first approached her during a period when her father was struggling with church finances, offering to help resolve some legal complications that were threatening the congregation's property rights. He had positioned himself as the family's savior, someone whose assistance came from genuine concern rather than self-interest. Once he establishes a relationship, William continued, he gradually escalates the intimacy while isolating the woman from potential sources of support. He uses his authority and experience to overcome their natural resistance, convincing them that what's happening is their choice rather than his manipulation. The files contained heartbreaking testimonies from witnesses who had known the judges. Victims. Sarah read about Maria Santos, a 19-year-old whose father had died in a mining accident, leaving her to care for 3 younger siblings. Judge Ashford had offered to help her family financially, then gradually coerced her into a relationship. When she became pregnant and threatened to expose him, she disappeared. Her body was found 3 months later in a river 20 miles away. Another file detailed the case of Rebecca Thompson, a teacher whose school had been facing closure due to financial difficulties. Judge Ashford had promised to help secure funding for the school in exchange for her friendship. Like the others, she had become pregnant. And like the others, she had died under suspicious circumstances when she became inconvenient. The most disturbing pattern, William said, watching Sarah's face as she processed the information, is that in every case, Judge Ashford arranged for the woman to be removed from the community before her death. They were either married off to men in distant locations or simply disappeared entirely. In your case, the auction was his way of accomplishing the same goal. Sarah felt sick as she understood how close she had come to following the same path as these other women. If William hadn't intervened, she would have been sold to Jeremiah Winters or Ezra Coleman, taken to some remote location where no one would ever think to look for her, and eventually killed when her pregnancy became inconvenient, or when she tried to contact her father. "How did you learn about all of this?" she asked. William's expression darkened with old pain. "It started with Catherine. After she died, I couldn't accept the official ruling of suicide. I hired private investigators to look into her death, and they uncovered connections to other suspicious deaths involving young women. The more we investigated, the clearer the pattern became." He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains where his sister had once walked. "It took me 2 years to get the Department of Justice interested in the case. Even then, they were more concerned about the financial corruption than the murders. Apparently, stealing money is considered more serious than killing women." Sarah could hear the bitterness in his voice, the frustration of someone who had fought against institutional indifference to seek justice for victims that society didn't consider worth protecting. "But you never gave up," she said. "I couldn't give up. Catherine deserved justice, and so did all the others. And I knew that as long as Judge Ashford remained in power, he would continue to find new victims." William returned to his chair and pulled out another document, this one bearing official government seals. 3 months ago, we finally gathered enough evidence of financial corruption to justify a federal investigation. But we still need testimony about his personal crimes to build a complete case. The financial charges might put him in prison for a few years, but they won't stop him permanently. He has too many connections, too much influence. He could be out and operating again within 5 years. But if someone testified about the murders, if someone testified about the pattern of personal relationships, the pregnancies, and the systematic elimination of witnesses, we could charge him with multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. Those charges would put him away permanently, and they would also implicate his accomplices. Sarah understood what William was asking, but she also understood the risks involved. If I testify against him, I'll be putting myself and my child in danger. Judge Ashford will certainly try to discredit you or eliminate you if he learns that you're cooperating with our investigation, William admitted. But you're safer now than you were this morning. You have a new identity, federal protection, and resources to defend yourself. Most importantly, you're not alone anymore. As if to emphasize his point, Eleanor knocked on the door and entered with a tea service and a plate of delicate sandwiches. The housekeeper's presence reminded Sarah that she was no longer facing her troubles in isolation. "I'll leave you to think about everything I've shown you," William said, gathering up the documents. "You don't need to make any decisions immediately. Take whatever time you need to process this information and consider your options." After William left, Sarah sat by the fire, sipping tea and trying to sort through the overwhelming revelations of the day. She had awakened that morning, expecting to be sold to a brutal stranger and resigned to a short, miserable life. Instead, she found herself in luxury and safety, married to a man who was offering her the chance to seek justice for herself and the other women who had suffered at Judge Ashford's hands. But the decision wasn't simple. Testifying against the judge would require her to relive the most humiliating experiences of her life in front of strangers, to admit publicly that she had been manipulated and used by a man she had once trusted. It would mean facing cross-examination by skilled lawyers who would try to portray her as a liar, a seductress, or a mentally unstable woman seeking attention. More frightening still, it would mean accepting that Judge Ashford would do everything in his power to destroy her before she could testify. The man who had killed at least 5 women would not hesitate to kill a 6th if it would protect his freedom and reputation. As evening fell and Eleanor brought her dinner on a silver tray, Sarah made her decision. She thought about Catherine Hartwell, who had tried to speak out and died for her courage. She thought about Maria Santos, Rebecca Thompson, and the other women whose names she had learned from William's files. She thought about her unborn child, who deserved to grow up in a world where powerful men couldn't simply eliminate inconvenient women. Most of all, she thought about the strength she had discovered in herself during the months of isolation and humiliation in Millhaven. She had survived the community's contempt, her father's weakness, and the terror of the auction. She had found the courage to defy Judge Ashford, even when she thought it would cost her everything. That evening, when William came to check on her, Sarah was ready with her answer. "I'll testify," she said simply. "Judge Ashford has taken enough. Lives, it's time someone stopped him." William nodded, respect and admiration evident in his expression. "It won't be easy. The trial will be difficult, and there will be people who try to destroy your credibility. But you won't be facing it alone." "I know," Sarah replied, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "And maybe that's enough." Outside, the mysterious rider who had followed them from Millhaven was making his way back to town with urgent news for Judge Ashford. The judge's carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down, but he still had time to prepare his defenses and eliminate the threat that Sarah Mitchell, Now Sarah Carter represented to his freedom and reputation. The battle for justice was about to begin, and Sarah had just chosen her side. Judge Cornelius Ashford sat behind his mahogany desk in his private chambers at the county courthouse, his usually composed demeanor cracked by the urgent message that had arrived just after midnight. The news that Sarah Mitchell had been purchased at auction by a federal investigator sent waves of panic through his carefully controlled world, but 40 years of legal and political maneuvering had taught him never to act rashly when cornered. The judge was an imposing figure even in private, standing 6 feet tall, with silver hair perfectly groomed, and penetrating dark eyes that had intimidated countless defendants and witnesses over the years. His office reflected his status and personality. Leather-bound law books lined the walls, expensive paintings depicted hunting scenes and legal allegories, and every piece of furniture had been chosen to project authority and respectability. But this morning, the man who had terrorized an entire region was facing the first real threat to his power that he had encountered in decades. The mysterious William Carter, whose real identity as federal investigator William Hartwell had been confirmed by his network of informants, possessed not only the resources to challenge him legally, but also a personal motivation that made him potentially more dangerous than any routine government investigation. "Tell me again exactly what happened at the auction," Ashford commanded the nervous man, standing before his desk. Jake Morrison was one of several local criminals who provided the judge with information and occasional services in exchange for protection from prosecution. "Like I said, Your Honor, everything was going according to plan. Winters was winning the bidding at $230, just like you arranged. Then this stranger shows up out of nowhere and bids $1,000 cash. Nobody in Millhaven had ever seen that kind of money." Ashford's jaw tightened as he considered the implications. He had orchestrated Sarah's auction precisely because it would remove her from the region permanently while making her disappearance appear legitimate. Jeremiah Winters had been carefully chosen for his reputation for working young wives to death on his remote ranch, where inconvenient questions were never asked and graves could be dug without witnesses. "What did you learn about this, William?" "Carter?" Ashford asked. Morrison shifted uncomfortably under the judge's intense stare. Not much that made sense at first. He was staying at the inn under that name, paid in advance, kept to himself mostly. But after the auction, I followed him like you told me to. That's when things got interesting." The judge leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Explain." "He took the girl to a big estate up in the mountains, fancy place with servants and everything. While I was watching from the woods, I saw him talking to her in what looked like some kind of serious conversation. They had papers spread out between them, official-looking documents." This information confirmed Ashford's worst fears. A wealthy man with access to official documents who was interested enough in Sarah Mitchell to pay an enormous sum for her suggested federal involvement in what should have been a simple local matter. "Did you see anything else?" The house had a name carved into a stone by the front gate, Hartwell House. "So I asked around at some taverns on my way back, and that's when I heard the story." Morrison paused, clearly uncomfortable with having to deliver news that he knew would anger the judge. The Hartwell family's been prominent in these parts for generations, but they had some kind of tragedy 3 years ago. Young woman named Catherine Hartwell was found dead in the river, supposedly. Suicide. But her brother never believed it, started making a lot of noise about investigating her death more thoroughly. Judge Ashford felt his blood turn to ice. Catherine Hartwell. He remembered her perfectly. 17 years old, beautiful, intelligent, and completely trusting until she became inconvenient. He had been more careful with her elimination than with some of the others, arranging for her death to look like suicide and ensuring that no physical evidence connected him to her disappearance. "William Hartwell," Ashford murmured, the pieces falling into place. "Catherine's brother. That's right, Your Honor. And from what I heard, he's been investigating corruption in this region for the federal government. Got himself appointed as some kind of special investigator after he convinced them that his sister's death was connected to a bigger pattern of crimes." The judge stood and walked to the window overlooking the courthouse square, where he had presided over countless trials with the knowledge that his verdicts were purchased rather than based on justice. The irony of facing potential judgment himself was not lost on him, but he was far from defeated. Cornelius Ashford had not accumulated power and wealth by accepting defeat when challenges arose. Over the years, he had destroyed evidence, eliminated witnesses, and corrupted officials at every level of government. One federal investigator with a personal vendetta would not be enough to bring down an empire that had taken decades to build. "Morrison," he said without turning from the window, "I want you to send messages to Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Washington. Use the usual channels, but make it clear that this is urgent. I need information about William Hartwell's investigation, who he's working with, what evidence he thinks he has, and what his timeline might be." "Yes, Your Honor. Anything else?" Ashford turned back to face his subordinate, his expression now cold and calculating. "I also need you to identify every person at that auction who might be able to testify about what they saw. Some of them will need to be convinced that their memories are unreliable. Others might need to be convinced to leave the region for their health." Morrison nodded, understanding the implied threat. The judge's methods for dealing with inconvenient witnesses were well known among his associates. "What about the girl herself? And Hartwell?" "Leave them to me," Ashford replied. "But I want them watched. Every move they make, every person they speak to, every document they examine. I need to know what they're planning before they have a chance to implement it." As Morrison left to carry out his orders, Judge Ashford began planning his defense, with the same methodical approach that had served him throughout his career. The first priority was protecting his assets and ensuring that if legal proceedings did begin, he would have the resources to mount an effective defense or disappear entirely if necessary. He opened a concealed safe behind one of his law books and removed several ledgers that contained the true records of his financial empire. Over the years, he had been careful to maintain accounts under various names in banks throughout the region and beyond. Money that appeared to be legitimate investments or inheritances was actually the proceeds from years of corruption, carefully laundered through a network of businesses and properties. The judge spent the next several hours reviewing these records and sending coded telegrams to associates in major cities. By evening, he had transferred substantial sums to accounts that could not be easily traced to him, arranged for certain incriminating documents to be destroyed, and activated a network of contacts who owed him favors or feared his retaliation. But financial preparations were only part of his strategy. Judge Ashford's real strength lay in his understanding of human weakness and his ability to manipulate people through their fears, desires, and secrets. William Hartwell might be driven by grief and a thirst for justice, but he was still a man, and all men had vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The judge's research into Hartwell's background revealed several potential pressure points. The federal investigator was unmarried, suggesting that his work had become an obsession that prevented normal relationships. His investigation had been ongoing for 3 years without producing charges, indicating that his superiors in Washington might be losing patience with his methods. Most importantly, his emotional investment in the case made him potentially reckless in ways that a more detached investigator might not be. As for Sarah Mitchell, now Sarah Carter, Her pregnancy made her physically vulnerable, while her youth and inexperience made her susceptible to psychological manipulation. The judge had successfully convinced dozens of women that they were complicit in their own victimization, and he was confident that he could do so again, if necessary. The next morning brought the first indication that Ashford's counterattack was beginning to take effect. A telegram arrived from one of his contacts in the federal government, providing crucial intelligence about Hartwell's investigation. The federal case against Judge Ashford was indeed real, but it was also more fragile than Hartwell probably realized. The evidence of financial corruption was substantial but largely circumstantial, requiring witness testimony to prove the connections between payments and specific judicial decisions. More importantly, the Justice Department was under political pressure to avoid high-profile prosecutions that might embarrass local authorities or disrupt business relationships. The telegram also revealed that Hartwell's investigation was being conducted with limited official support. His superiors tolerated his work because it occasionally produced useful intelligence, but they had made it clear that any charges against prominent officials would require overwhelming evidence and careful political considerations. This information gave Judge Ashford hope. A federal investigator operating with limited backing and driven by personal emotions was exactly the kind of opponent he preferred. Such men tended to overreach, to pursue justice at the expense of procedure, creating opportunities for their targets to escape through legal technicalities or political maneuvering. But the judge's confidence was shaken by the arrival of an unexpected visitor that afternoon. Mayor Harrison Blackwood appeared at his chambers, clearly agitated and demanding an immediate private meeting. "Cornelius, we need to talk," Blackwood said, his usual deference replaced by obvious anxiety. "This situation with the Mitchell girl has gotten completely out of hand." Judge Ashford gestured for the mayor to close the door and take a seat, though he remained standing himself to maintain the psychological advantage of height and position. "I assume you're referring to her marriage." "To William Carter. I'm referring to the fact that William Carter is a federal investigator who just paid $1,000 to acquire the one person who could destroy both of us," Blackwood snapped. "Did you know about this when you suggested the auction?" The judge's expression remained neutral, but internally he was calculating how much Blackwood actually knew about his involvement in Sarah's situation. The mayor had been useful in orchestrating the auction, but he was not privy to the full scope of the judge's activities. "I suggested the auction as a solution to a local problem," Ashford replied carefully. "I had no way of knowing that federal investigators were operating in the region. Well, they are, and according to my sources, they've been watching both of us for months. The Carter identity was apparently a cover, and the real William Hartwell has been building a case against regional corruption." Blackwood stood and began pacing the small space in front of the judge's desk, his agitation growing with each step. This whole thing was supposed to make the scandal go away quietly. Instead, we've handed our biggest potential witness directly to a federal investigator who has every reason to use her against us. Judge Ashford studied the mayor's panicked behavior with growing contempt. Blackwood was exactly the kind of weak ally who became a liability when pressure mounted. His anxiety would make him prone to mistakes, and his knowledge of certain arrangements could prove dangerous if he decided to cooperate with investigators to save himself. "Harrison," the judge said, in a tone calculated to project calm authority, "you're allowing fear to cloud your judgment. The fact that Hartwell paid such an enormous sum for the girl suggests that he's desperate, not confident. Desperate men make poor decisions, and poor decisions create opportunities for their opponents. What kind of opportunities? The kind that eliminate problems permanently," Ashford replied, his meaning unmistakable. Blackwood stopped pacing and stared at the judge in horror. "You're talking about murder, about killing a federal investigator and his witness." "I'm talking about protecting ourselves and our interests by whatever means prove necessary," the judge corrected. "You seem to have forgotten that you're as deeply involved in this situation as I am. Your cooperation in arranging the auction makes you an accessory to whatever charges might be brought." The threat was clear, and Blackwood understood that he was no longer just an ally, but potentially a victim of the judge's ruthless pragmatism. His face went pale as he realized that his survival might depend on the success of whatever plan Ashford was developing. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. "For now, continue your normal activities and report anything unusual that you observe, but be prepared to take more direct action if the situation requires it." After Blackwood left, Judge Ashford returned to his planning with renewed focus. The mayor's visit had confirmed that the situation was indeed urgent, but it had also revealed potential weaknesses in Hartwell's position. A federal investigator who operated with limited official support, who had paid an enormous personal price for a single witness, was a man who could be isolated and destroyed if the right pressure were applied. The judge spent the remainder of the day refining his strategy, identifying specific actions that would systematically undermine Hartwell's investigation while creating plausible alternative explanations for Sarah's testimony. By evening, he had developed a multifaceted plan that would attack his enemies on legal, political, and personal fronts simultaneously. The battle for his survival was about to begin in earnest, and Judge Cornelius Ashford was determined to emerge victorious, regardless of how many lives he needed to destroy in the process. Sarah Mitchell might think she had found safety in William Hartwell's protection, but she was about to learn that the judge's reach extended far beyond the boundaries of his courtroom. The war between justice and corruption was entering its most dangerous phase, and the stakes had never been higher for any of the participants. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp November morning, when Eleanor discovered that someone had been watching Hartwell House during the night. Boot prints in the frost-covered ground near the edge of the property were too deliberate to be casual trespassers, and the positioning suggested surveillance rather than theft. William examined the tracks with the trained eye of someone who had spent years investigating criminal activity. "Professional work," he concluded grimly, noting how the observer had chosen positions that provided clear views of the house while remaining concealed from casual observation. Judge Ashford didn't waste any time responding to our presence, Sarah, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. After 3 weeks at Hartwell House, she had begun to feel safe for the first time since her pregnancy had been discovered. The luxury and security of the estate, combined with Eleanor's maternal care and William's respectful protection, had allowed her to imagine a future beyond constant fear and humiliation. Now that fragile sense of safety was shattered by the knowledge that the judge had found them and was actively planning his response. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where her unborn child seemed to sense her distress and began moving restlessly. "What does this mean for our timeline?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear that was building. Inside her, William studied the tracks for another moment before answering. "It means Judge Ashford knows where we are and is gathering intelligence about our activities. He's also probably trying to determine how much evidence we have and what our strategy might be." They walked back toward the house, where Eleanor was waiting with obvious concern. The housekeeper had lived through the tragedy of Catherine's death and understood better than anyone what Judge Ashford was capable of when he felt threatened. "How much danger are we in?" Sarah asked as they entered the warm kitchen where Eleanor had prepared breakfast. "That depends on how desperate the judge becomes," William replied honestly. "Right now, he's probably exploring legal and political options to neutralize our investigation. But if those fail, he won't hesitate to use more direct methods. Eleanor set down her coffee cup with enough force to make it rattle against the saucer. That monster has already killed at least 6 women that we know of. He's not going to stop at 7 and 8 just because one of them is pregnant and the other is a federal investigator. The blunt assessment hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah had known intellectually that testifying against Judge Ashford would be dangerous, but Eleanor's words forced her to confront the reality that she and her unborn child might not survive long enough to see justice done. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The months of adversity in Millhaven had taught her that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. William pulled out a chair and sat across from her at the kitchen table. "We accelerate our timeline and take steps to protect ourselves while we build the strongest possible case." Over the next hour, William outlined a comprehensive strategy that addressed both their immediate safety and the long-term goal of bringing Judge Ashford to justice. The plan was complex and dangerous, requiring Sarah to play a more active role than she had anticipated. "The first priority is getting your testimony formally recorded and secured," William explained. "If something happens to either of us, the evidence needs to survive to ensure that the judge faces consequences for his crimes." This meant traveling to Philadelphia, where federal prosecutors could take Sarah's detailed statement under oath while providing security that would be difficult for the judge to penetrate. The trip would be risky, requiring them to leave the relative safety of the estate, but it was essential for preserving evidence that might otherwise be lost. "The second element is gathering additional witnesses and evidence to corroborate your testimony," William continued. "We need to find people who can confirm details about the judge's behavior, his relationship with you, and the circumstances surrounding other victims." Sarah understood the importance of this step, but also recognized how difficult it would be to accomplish. Most of the people who had witnessed the judge's actions were either dead, disappeared, or too frightened to speak against such a powerful figure. "Who would be willing to testify?" she asked. "We start with the people who cared about the other victims," William replied. "Family members, friends, anyone who might have observed suspicious circumstances surrounding their disappearances. Fear has kept them silent, but sometimes the right approach can overcome fear." Eleanor, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "What about Dr. Patterson in Millhaven? He was the one who confirmed your pregnancy, and he's been the doctor for most of the families in the region for decades. If anyone would have noticed patterns in the deaths of young women, it would be him." William nodded thoughtfully. "That's an excellent suggestion. Medical professionals often observe things that others miss, and Dr. Patterson's reputation for integrity might make him willing to speak if he understands the larger pattern." The third element of their strategy involved gathering financial evidence that could be used to prove the judge's corruption, even if personal testimony was successfully discredited. William had been working with federal accountants to trace the judge's assets and income, but they needed access to local records that could establish specific connections between payments and judicial decisions. "This is where the real danger begins," William warned. "Obtaining those records will require us to work with people who are currently under the judge's influence or protection. Some of them might be willing to cooperate if they understand that the judge's empire is collapsing, but others will try to warn him about our activities." Sarah listened to the details of the plan with growing appreciation for both its complexity and its risks. William wasn't just asking her to testify about her personal experiences, he was asking her to become an active participant in a dangerous investigation that could cost both their lives. "There's something else you need to understand," William said, his expression growing more serious. "Once we begin this process, there's no going back. Judge Ashford will know that we're building a case against him, and he'll do everything in his power to stop us. That includes targeting anyone who helps us, threatening our families, and potentially attempting to eliminate us entirely. Eleanor reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. My dear, you don't have to do this. William has been pursuing this investigation for 3 years without your testimony. He could continue that work while you start a new life somewhere safe. Sarah considered the option carefully. She could disappear, assume a new identity, raise her child in a distant city where Judge Ashford's influence couldn't reach. It would mean abandoning her father, never seeing Millhaven again, and living always with the knowledge that the judge continued to prey on other women. But it would also mean safety and the chance to build a normal life. No, she said finally, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. I've spent months being afraid, letting other people make decisions about my life. Catherine Hartwell tried to speak out and died for it. If I run away now, her death means nothing, and the other women who've died mean nothing. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where she had found refuge from the nightmare of her old life. Judge Ashford thinks he can terrorize women into silence by killing the ones who resist. Maybe it's time he learned that killing one of us just makes the others more determined. William felt a surge of admiration for Sarah's courage, but also a deepening sense of responsibility for her safety. He had saved her from the auction in Millhaven, but now he was asking her to face dangers that might prove even more deadly than what she had escaped. If we do this, he said, we do it properly. Full security precautions, detailed planning, and backup plans for every contingency. Judge Ashford has had decades to perfect his methods, but he's never faced organized opposition with federal resources. The next 3 days were spent in intensive preparation. William sent coded messages to contacts in Philadelphia, arranging for secure transportation and safe houses. Eleanor packed supplies and organized the household as if they might not return. For weeks or months, Sarah spent hours going over her testimony with William, ensuring that every detail was accurate and that she could present her experiences clearly under the pressure of cross-examination. The emotional toll of reliving her relationship with Judge Ashford was enormous. Sarah found herself remembering conversations and incidents that she had tried to forget, details that now seemed obviously manipulative but had appeared natural at the time. The judge's skill at psychological manipulation was revealed in its full sophistication as she traced the gradual process by which he had isolated her from potential sources of support and convinced her that their relationship was her choice. Rather than his design, he made me feel special, Sarah explained during one of their preparation sessions. He said I was more intelligent and mature than other girls my age, that I could understand things they couldn't. It made me feel grown up and important. That's a classic technique, William replied. Predators identify their victims' vulnerabilities and use them as entry points. In your case, your intelligence and curiosity made you feel different from your peers, so he exploited that sense of being special. Understanding the psychology behind her victimization was both liberating and horrifying. Sarah realized that she had never been chosen because of any unique quality that made her irresistible. She had been selected because her circumstances made her vulnerable, and her personality made her manipulable. But this understanding also gave her strength. The shame and self-blame that had tormented her for months began to dissolve as she recognized that she had been the victim of a calculating predator, not a willing participant in her own destruction. On their final evening at Hartwell House before departing for Philadelphia, Sarah found herself in Catherine's room, looking through items that Eleanor had preserved from William's sister. Photographs showed a beautiful young woman with intelligent eyes and a warm smile, someone who looked remarkably similar to Sarah herself. Among Catherine's possessions was a journal that she had apparently kept during her relationship with Judge Ashford. Reading the entries was like looking into a mirror that reflected Sarah's own experiences with painful accuracy. "He says he loves me, but only when we're alone," one entry read. "In public, he acts like I'm just another young woman from the community. Sometimes I wonder if I'm imagining the whole relationship." Another entry, dated shortly before Catherine's death, was even more revealing. "I told him about the baby today. He said terrible things, accused me of trying to trap him, threatened to deny everything if I told anyone. I don't understand how the man who said he loved me could become so cruel so quickly." The journal's final entry was dated 2 days before. "Catherine's body was found in the river. I've decided to tell the truth, no matter what he threatens to do to me. Other women deserve to know what kind of man he really is." Sarah closed the journal with tears in her eyes, understanding that she was about to follow the same path that had led to Catherine's death. But she also understood that Catherine's courage had not been wasted. Her death had motivated William to begin his investigation, and now Sarah had the opportunity to finish what Catherine had started. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for Philadelphia, William pulled Sarah aside for a final conversation about the risks they were about to face. "It's not too late to change your mind," he said. "Judge Ashford is going to throw everything he has at us once he realizes what we're doing. The next few weeks will test every bit of courage and determination you possess." Sarah looked back at Artwell House, where she had found safety and begun to heal from the trauma of her experiences in Millhaven. She knew she might never see it again, that the journey they were beginning could end in their deaths. "William," she said, "I want you to know that whatever happens, you've already given me something invaluable. You've given me back my dignity and my sense of myself as a person worth saving. That's enough, even if we don't survive what comes next." As their carriage rolled down the mountain road toward Philadelphia and the confrontation that would determine all their fates, neither Sarah nor William noticed the rider who emerged from the woods behind them, spurring his horse toward Millhaven, with urgent news for Judge Ashford about their departure and destination. The ambush came at dawn on the second day of their journey to Philadelphia, on a stretch of mountain road that offered no escape routes and perfect concealment for attackers. Sarah was dozing fitfully against William's shoulder when the first rifle shot shattered the morning silence, killing their driver instantly and sending the horses into a panicked frenzy. "Get down!" William shouted, pulling Sarah to the carriage floor as bullets splintered the wooden walls around them. The vehicle lurched violently as the terrified horses tried to bolt, but a second volley brought down the lead horse, causing the carriage to overturn in a thunderous crash of breaking wood and screaming animals. Sarah found herself trapped beneath. William's protective body as gunfire continued to rake their overturned refuge. Through gaps in the shattered wood, she could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions along the rocky hillside above them. This wasn't a random robbery. It was a carefully planned execution designed to eliminate both witnesses. "And evidence. How many?" William whispered, drawing a revolver from inside his coat while trying to assess their situation. "At least 6 shooters, probably more," Sarah replied, surprising him with her calm observation. The months of adversity had taught her to think clearly under pressure, and her father's hunting lessons from childhood helped her interpret the sounds and patterns of the gunfire. Their carriage had overturned near a cluster of large boulders that provided some protection, but their position was ultimately hopeless. The attackers held the high ground, had superior numbers, and could simply wait for their ammunition to run out. Worse yet, Sarah's pregnancy made rapid movement impossible, eliminating any chance of reaching better cover. "Mrs. Carter," William said, using her married name even in their desperate circumstances, "I need you to listen carefully. These men aren't here to take prisoners. When I create a distraction, I want you to crawl toward those rocks and hide. Don't try to help me, don't look back, just survive. "I won't leave you," Sarah said firmly, her hand finding his arm. "We face this together, or we die together." Before William could argue, a new voice cut through the gunfire from somewhere up the hillside. "William Hartwell, this is Sheriff Tom Bradley from Clearwater County. You're surrounded and outgunned. Release the woman and surrender yourself. And we might be able to work something out." William's jaw tightened as he recognized the implications. Judge Ashford had somehow convinced local law enforcement that they were criminals, creating a legal justification for what was essentially a murder squad. The corruption network was deeper and more sophisticated than even he had suspected. "Sheriff Bradley," William called back, "I'm a federal investigator with the Department of Justice. The woman with me is a protected witness, traveling under federal authority." Harsh laughter echoed from the hillside. "That's an interesting story. But we have warrants for both of you. Sarah Mitchell for theft and fraud, William Hartwell for kidnapping and impersonating a federal officer." Sarah felt her blood run cold as she understood the trap they had walked into. Judge Ashford hadn't just arranged for their elimination. He had created a legal framework that would justify their deaths while protecting everyone involved in the ambush. "Show me the warrants," William demanded, buying time while he searched for any possible escape route. "You'll see them after you surrender," Bradley replied. "You have 1 minute to make your decision before we come down there and collect your bodies." The situation seemed hopeless, but Sarah noticed something that the attackers might have missed. The overturned carriage had come to rest near a narrow ravine that cut down through the mountainside. If they could reach the edge without being seen, they might be able to slide down into cover and work their way to the valley below. "William," she whispered, "the ravine. Can you see it?" He followed her gaze and nodded grimly. The route would be dangerous and difficult, especially for a pregnant woman, but it was their only chance. "It's at least 30 feet to the bottom and the sides are steep. In your condition." "In my condition, I'm dead anyway if we stay here," Sarah interrupted. "At least this way, we have a chance." The sound of men moving down the hillside indicated that their time was running out. William made the decision with the efficiency of someone trained for combat situations. "On my signal, we move fast and quiet toward the ravine. Once we go over the edge, we're committed. There's no climbing back up." Sarah nodded, checking to ensure that the precious documents about Judge Ashford's corruption were still secure in the leather satchel she carried. Whatever happened to them, the evidence needed to survive. William waited until he heard the attackers' voices growing closer, then grabbed Sarah's hand and made their desperate dash toward the ravine. They had covered perhaps 15 feet when a shout indicated they had been spotted, followed immediately by a renewed barrage of gunfire. The edge of the ravine appeared ahead of them like salvation, but Sarah stumbled just as they reached it, her pregnancy affecting her balance at the worst possible moment. William caught her and half carried, half threw her over the edge just as bullets whined through the space where they had been standing. The descent was a nightmare of sliding rocks, thorny vegetation, and barely controlled falls. Sarah felt branches tear at her dress, and stones cut her hands as she fought to control her tumbling descent. Above them, angry voices shouted orders as the ambushers realized their quarry was escaping. They reached the bottom of the ravine, bloodied and bruised, but alive. William immediately pulled Sarah into the cover of overhanging rocks as rifle shots echoed from above, the bullets ricocheting harmlessly off stone walls. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, noting the blood on her hands and the torn condition of her dress. "Nothing serious," Sarah replied, though she could feel various cuts and bruises that would probably become more painful as the shock wore off. More importantly, she could still feel the baby moving inside her, suggesting that the fall hadn't caused any immediate damage. The ravine stretched ahead of them like a natural corridor, winding down through the mountains toward the distant valley. If they could follow it without being intercepted, they might reach civilization and potential help. But their pursuers weren't giving up easily. They could hear men moving along the rim of the ravine above them, trying to find safe paths down to continue the pursuit. Sheriff Bradley's voice carried clearly in the mountain air as he organized his men for a systematic hunt. They can't have gone far in their condition. Johnson, take 3 men and work your way down through Devil's Gap. Morrison, circle around to the south and cut off their escape route. The rest of you spread out along the rim and watch for movement. William realized they were facing professional tracking, not the random violence of common criminals. These men knew the terrain and had experience hunting fugitives through difficult country. We need to move fast, he told Sarah. They'll have us surrounded within the hour if we don't reach open ground. They began working their way down the ravine, using every available bit of cover while trying to move as quickly as Sarah's condition allowed. The going was treacherous, with loose rocks and hidden obstacles that threatened to send them tumbling with every step. Behind them, they could hear their pursuers getting closer, the sounds of boots on stone and voices calling out positions. Judge Ashford had clearly spared no expense in organizing this manhunt, bringing in experienced men who wouldn't be easily discouraged by difficult terrain or adverse conditions. After an hour of desperate flight, they emerged from the ravine into a broader valley where a small stream meandered between stands of pine trees. The open ground offered better traveling, but also made them more visible to anyone watching from the surrounding heights. "There," Sarah said, pointing toward a column of smoke rising from beyond a distant ridge. "Someone's there. Maybe a farm or a logging camp." William studied the terrain carefully, weighing their options. Reaching the smoke would require crossing open ground where they would be exposed to rifle fire from multiple directions. But staying in the ravine meant certain capture as their pursuers closed the net around them. "We'll have to risk it," he decided, "but we go fast and we don't stop for anything." They began their dash across the valley floor, William supporting Sarah when her strength flagged and urging her forward when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Behind them, shouts indicated that they had been spotted, followed by the distant crack of rifle fire. The shots fell short, but Sarah could hear bullets whining overhead as their pursuers tried to bring them down from extreme range. Each step felt like it might be her last, but the thought of her unborn child gave her strength to keep moving when her body wanted to collapse. They were halfway across the valley when disaster struck. Sarah stumbled over a hidden root and fell, hard, crying out in pain as she felt something tear inside her abdomen. When William helped her to her feet, he could see blood beginning to stain her dress. "The baby," she gasped, her face white with pain and fear. William scooped her up in his arms and continued running toward the smoke, knowing that stopping now meant death for all 3 of them. Sarah bit back her cries of pain, understanding that any sound might guide their pursuers to their location. The source of the smoke turned out to be a small logging camp where 4 men were taking their morning break around a campfire. They looked up in amazement as William staggered into their clearing, carrying a bloodied pregnant woman. "Help us," William gasped. "Federal investigator, protected witness, men trying to kill us." The loggers' leader, a grizzled man named Pete Donovan, took one look at Sarah's condition and made an immediate decision. "Get her into the cabin. Tommy, ride for Doc Harrison in Millerville, fast as you can." As they carried Sarah into the rough log structure that served as the camp's shelter, William could hear their pursuers getting closer. Sheriff Bradley's voice was clearly audible now, demanding that the loggers surrender the fugitives or face charges as accomplices. "Federal investigator, you say?" Pete asked, as he helped settle Sarah on a rough bunk. William showed him his credentials, which Pete examined carefully despite his obvious urgency. "Well, that's federal authority, and it trumps any county sheriff. Boys, looks like we're about to have ourselves a little disagreement with the local law." The 4 loggers armed themselves with rifles and took positions around their camp, transforming from simple workmen into a defensive force in a matter of minutes. William realized they had found unexpected allies in men who understood the difference between real law enforcement and corrupt officials with badges. Sheriff Bradley and his men appeared at the edge of the clearing within minutes, but stopped short when they saw armed resistance waiting for them. "This is county business," Bradley called out. "Those people are wanted criminals, and you're interfering with legal proceedings." "Those people are under federal protection," Pete replied calmly. "And you're trespassing on private property with hostile intent. I suggest you back off before this gets ugly." The standoff that followed would determine whether Sarah lived to testify against Judge Ashford, whether William's investigation would survive, and whether justice would finally triumph over the corruption that had terrorized the region for decades. Inside the cabin, Sarah fought for consciousness as blood continued to seep from her wounds, her unborn child's fate hanging in the balance, along with the future of their desperate quest for justice. The standoff at the logging camp stretched through the longest night of Sarah's life. Inside the rough cabin, she drifted in and out of consciousness while Dr. Harrison worked to stabilize her condition and save her unborn child. Outside, Pete Donovan and his men maintained their vigil against Sheriff Bradley's forces, creating an island of protection in the midst of Judge Ashford's expanding web of corruption. "The bleeding stopped," Dr. Harrison announced near midnight, his weathered face showing cautious optimism. "The baby's still moving, which is a good sign, but she needs real medical care, not what I can provide in a logging camp." William knelt beside Sarah's makeshift bed, taking her hand in his. Despite everything they had endured, her grip was still, strong, and her eyes held the same determination that had carried her through months of adversity. "How long before we can move her safely?" he asked the doctor. 24 hours minimum, assuming no complications. But moving her at all is risky. That fall could have caused internal injuries that won't show symptoms for days. Through the cabin's small window, William could see the flickering campfires of Sheriff Bradley's men, who had settled in for a siege rather than risking a direct assault on the well-armed loggers. The corrupt sheriff was clearly waiting for reinforcements or hoping that his quarry would surrender to avoid bloodshed. But William knew that surrender meant death for both him and Sarah. Judge Ashford couldn't allow them to survive long enough to tell their story, regardless of what legal justifications he manufactured to cover their elimination. "There has to be another way out of this," Sarah whispered, her voice weak but clear. "We can't stay here forever, and these men shouldn't have to die protecting us." Pete Donovan, who had been checking his rifle near the door, turned toward them with a grim smile. "Ma'am, those boys out there aren't real law enforcement. They're hired guns with badges, and men like me have been dealing with their kind for longer than you might think." The logger's confidence was reassuring, but William understood the tactical reality. They were outnumbered at least 3-1, surrounded and responsible for protecting a critically injured pregnant woman. Even if they won the immediate confrontation, Judge Ashford would simply send more men until the problem was permanently resolved. The solution came from an unexpected source. Tommy Henderson, the youngest of the loggers, had ridden out before the siege began to fetch Dr. Harrison. Now he returned with more than just medical help. "Mr. Hartwell," Tommy called quietly from outside the cabin, "there's someone here who says he needs to talk to you." Federal Marshal from Philadelphia, William felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. He had sent messages to his contacts in the Justice Department before leaving Hartwell House, but the timing of this arrival seemed almost too convenient. Marshal Robert Kane proved to be exactly what he claimed, a federal law enforcement officer with credentials that even Pete Donovan's careful scrutiny couldn't question. More importantly, he brought with him a squad of 12 federal deputies and written authorization to arrest Judge Ashford on charges of corruption and murder. "We've been tracking the judge's activities for months," Marshal Kane explained as he studied the situation around the logging camp. Your messages provided the final pieces we needed to move forward with arrests. The marshal's arrival transformed the dynamics completely. Sheriff Bradley found himself facing legitimate federal authority, backed by superior numbers and unquestionable legal standing. When Kane ordered him to withdraw his men and explain his actions, the corrupt sheriff's confidence evaporated like morning mist. "I have warrants for the arrest of William Hartwell and Sarah Mitchell," Bradley insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Marshal Kane examined the documents with professional thoroughness. "These warrants are forgeries," he announced loudly. "Enough for everyone to hear. The signatures are false, the dates are impossible, and the charges are fabricated. Sheriff Bradley, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and impersonating federal authority." The collapse of Sheriff Bradley's legal justification triggered a rapid disintegration of his force. Several of his men, realizing they had been tricked into participating in attempted murder, immediately surrendered to the federal marshals. Others tried to flee, but were quickly captured by deputies who had positioned themselves around the area. Within 2 hours of Marshal Kane's arrival, the immediate threat had been eliminated. But the larger battle for justice was just beginning. "Judge Ashford won't be taken easily," Marshal Kane warned as they prepared to transport Sarah to proper medical facilities. "He has resources, political connections, and decades of experience protecting himself from legal challenges. Then we make sure the case against him is so strong that his connections can't save him," William replied, his hand resting protectively on Sarah's shoulder as she lay on a stretcher prepared for the journey to Philadelphia. The trip to the federal courthouse took 3 days, with Sarah traveling in a specially equipped medical wagon while federal marshals provided security. Dr. Harrison accompanied them, monitoring her condition and ensuring that the stress of travel didn't trigger complications that could endanger her or the baby. During the journey, Sarah insisted on reviewing her testimony despite her physical weakness. She understood that this might be her only opportunity to speak for Catherine Hartwell, Maria Santos, Rebecca Thompson, and all the other women who had died at Judge Ashford's hands. "I need to make sure I remember everything correctly," she told William as they went over the details of her relationship with the judge. "One mistake, one inconsistency, and his lawyers will use it to discredit everything else." William marveled at her determination. Most people would have been content simply to survive their ordeal, but Sarah seemed driven by a sense of responsibility that extended far beyond her personal safety. The federal courthouse in Philadelphia was an imposing stone structure that represented everything Judge Ashford's corruption had undermined: the rule of law, equal justice, and protection for the innocent. As Sarah was helped up the courthouse steps, she felt the weight of history and the hopes of countless victims resting on her shoulders. Federal prosecutor James Madison Thompson had built his career on complex corruption cases. But even he was impressed by the scope of evidence that William's investigation had assembled. The financial records alone were enough to send Judge Ashford to prison for decades, while the pattern of murdered witnesses elevated the charges to capital crimes. "Mrs. Carter," Prosecutor Thompson said as they prepared for Sarah's formal testimony, "I want you to understand that this case will attract national attention. Judge Ashford's lawyers will try to destroy your credibility by any means necessary. They'll claim you're lying for money, seeking revenge for imagined wrongs, or mentally unstable due to your pregnancy." Sarah straightened in her chair, her blue eyes blazing with determination. "Mr. Thompson, I've been called worse things by better people. Let them try to discredit me. The truth has a power that lies can't overcome." The grand jury hearing that followed became a watershed moment in the fight against regional corruption. For 6 hours, Sarah testified with devastating precision about Judge Ashford's systematic abuse of power, his manipulation of vulnerable women, and his elimination of witnesses who threatened to expose his crimes. She spoke about Catherine Hartwell's journal, which provided crucial corroboration for the pattern of abuse. She detailed the financial arrangements that had corrupted the judicial system throughout Pennsylvania. Most powerfully, she testified about the other victims, women whose voices had been silenced but whose stories deserved to be heard. When Sarah finished her testimony, the grand jury room was silent except for the scratching of the court reporter's pen. Several jurors were openly weeping, while others sat with expressions of cold anger that promised justice for the victims. The grand jury's decision was unanimous. Judge Cornelius Ashford would face charges of murder, conspiracy, corruption, and racketeering. Federal marshals were dispatched immediately to arrest him, supported by evidence so comprehensive that even his political connections couldn't provide protection. Judge Ashford's arrest at his courthouse office became the stuff of legend. Federal marshals found him calmly burning documents in his fireplace, still believing that his influence and resources would protect him from consequences. His shock when the handcuffs clicked shut was captured by newspaper photographers, creating an image that would symbolize the downfall of corrupt officials throughout the region. The trial that followed dominated national headlines for months. Sarah's testimony from the witness stand was both heartbreaking and powerful, delivered with a strength that inspired other victims of powerful men to come forward with their own stories. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that Judge Ashford's lawyers eventually advised him to accept a plea agreement rather than face the death penalty. Judge Cornelius Ashford was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. His financial empire was dismantled, with recovered assets used to compensate victims and their families. Mayor Harrison Blackwood and dozens of other corrupt officials were also prosecuted, effectively destroying the criminal network that had terrorized the region for decades. But for Sarah, the most meaningful victory came 3 months after the key trial, when she gave birth to a healthy daughter in the safety and comfort of Hartwell House. Eleanor served as midwife, while William paced nervously outside the bedroom door like any expectant father. "She's beautiful," Eleanor announced as she placed the baby in Sarah's arms. "Perfect and healthy despite everything you've been through." Sarah looked down at her daughter's face, seeing not the product of manipulation and abuse, but a symbol of hope and new beginnings. The baby would grow up in a world where justice was possible, where corrupt officials could be held accountable, and where women's voices mattered. "What will you name her?" William asked as he was finally allowed to meet his adoptive daughter. Sarah smiled, thinking of all the women who had sacrificed so much for this moment of justice. "Catherine Hope Carter," she said. "Catherine for the woman whose courage started this investigation and hope for what we've built together." 5 years later, Sarah stood before a gathering of women's rights advocates in Washington, D.C., her 4-year-old daughter playing quietly nearby while she addressed the crowd. The Ashford case had inspired federal legislation protecting witnesses and victims, while Sarah herself had become a powerful voice for justice reform. "The system failed me, just as it failed Catherine Hartwell and so many others," she told the assembled activists. "But we didn't let that failure have the final word. We fought back, we told the truth, and we demanded that powerful men face consequences for their actions." In the audience, William watched with pride as his wife continued her transformation from victim to advocate. Their marriage, which had begun as a desperate rescue, had evolved into a true partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. Judge Ashford died in federal prison 7 years after his conviction, unrepentant to the end, but powerless to hurt anyone else. His death marked the final chapter of a reign of terror that had lasted decades, ended by the courage of one pregnant woman who refused to be silenced. The town of Millhaven eventually erected a memorial to the victims of corruption, with Catherine Hartwell's name inscribed alongside those of Maria Santos, Rebecca Thompson, and the other women who had died seeking justice. Sarah attended the dedication ceremony, bringing her daughter to see the memorial and understand the price that had been paid for the freedom they now enjoyed. As mother and daughter stood before the memorial stone, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been buried alive, not in a grave, but in shame, fear, and powerlessness. But like the original Emma Caldwell, she had refused to let evil have the final word. "Mama," little Catherine asked, "why are all these names here?" Sarah knelt beside her daughter, choosing her words carefully. "They're here because sometimes bad people try to hurt good people. But these women were brave enough to fight back even when it was dangerous. Because of their courage, you get to grow up in a world where bad people can't hurt others without facing consequences." The sun was setting behind the mountains as they walked back toward their carriage, where William waited to take them home to the estate that had become a refuge for other women seeking justice and safety. The work of fighting corruption would continue, led by a new generation of advocates who understood that individual courage could transform entire systems. Sarah Carter, formerly Sarah Mitchell, the preacher's pregnant daughter who had once been auctioned off like property, had become living proof that no one is ever truly powerless when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Her story would inspire countless others to speak truth to power, ensuring that the voices of the vulnerable would never again be silenced by those who sought to exploit them. The mysterious stranger who had outbid everyone at the auction had saved more than just one woman and her child. He had helped preserve the principle that justice, however delayed, would eventually triumph over corruption, and that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose courage over fear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.